Okay, good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are across the country. I'm Larry Haven, Professor Emeritus of Industrial Relations at St. Mary's University in Halifax and former President of the Canadian Industrial Relations Association. CIRA is an organization of industrial relations academics and practitioners who work in places like government, unions, employers, and the law. If you're in any of those groups and you're not members of CIRA, we invite you to join. You might be interested in our annual conference, which this year will be at UQAM, Université du Québec à Montréal, from May 2nd to May the 4th. And our website is cira-acri.ca. This is the second webinar in the fourth series, fourth year, on industrial relations issues brought to you by CIRA. A couple of technical details about the webinar. Except for the webcam on our two panelists and me for the first few minutes, we will be doing audio only today. The panelists will have about 40 minutes comprising two interventions. They'll be talking as a team. And then we'll have a question period of about 20 or so minutes. So everybody in the audience is presently muted. When the question period begins, please go to the GoToMeeting menu, which you will have seen as soon as you got in, which is in the upper right-hand portion of your screen, and click the button that indicates you want to speak. I will see a raised hand for each prospective speaker as these requests come in. I'll then call on you and unmute you in the order in which you raised your hand, hopefully. It doesn't, this platform doesn't actually tell me what order people have raised their hand, but we'll do the best we can. I'll ask you to remember to unclick the raised hand once you've finished your intervention, or it starts to get confusing. And we'll end at about 55 minutes after the hour, so I can say goodbye and thanks. And as Deanna has said, if you can't somehow get through with voice, or you're just about to leave, or for some reason you can't get through, then just send a message on chat and we'll try and get to those questions too. But what's often the case is we don't get to all the questions by the end of the webinar. I also beg the indulgence of the Francophone participants of the audience. CIRA attempts to be a binational organization and to do most of what it does in simultaneous translation, but this series of webinars will be in English only. And now a bit about our topic today. The campaign for a living wage is making its way across Canada. It proposes that in each geographic or economic zone, a wage can be calculated that would allow families to make ends meet and participate in community life. Employers are then lobbied to sign on and commit themselves and their contractees to paying at least this much. And employees are signing on. BC alone has over 100 living wage employers, representing over 18,000 direct staff and countless staff in contracted labor services. The living wage is different from the minimum wage, and for the fight for 15, this webinar explores both the differences and the common themes between the living wage and the minimum wage campaign. And a bit of biography about our panelists. Deanna Ogle is campaign organizer with the BC Living Wage for Families campaign. And Catherine Ludgate is manager community investment with the Vancity Credit Union in Vancouver. Vancity is Canada's largest private sector living wage employer. And now I'll hand it over to Deanna and Catherine.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Larry. Thanks everyone who took time out of their day to hear us present. I really look forward to the dialogue that's going to happen as a result. I appreciate the time that it takes to kind of participate in these webinars. So first off, I just wanted to acknowledge that the work that we're doing and presenting is taking place on traditional unceded Coast Salish territory. So the traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam peoples. And I just wanted to acknowledge that and also acknowledge the role of historical inequalities and colonization on the work that we do and how that has created systems of poverty. So I'll be talking a little bit throughout about some of those things, but just wanted to kind of frame it for us as we move forward. So I'm going to start with this first slide. The first slide is actually a picture of my family. So this is, I'm the girl in the back with the long hair. And I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about our own experiences and frame that in this context. So 1 out of every 3 poor children in BC lives in a family where one parent works full time. And although I didn't grow up in BC, I grew up in Saskatchewan, I did grow up in a home where both my parents worked more than full-time hours in order to make ends meet. So when my mother got a job as a support worker, this in a local hospital, a union job, this changed. It was stable employment at a living wage. Now, as a child, I didn't really understand that context, but what I did understand is that my family went out for supper. So growing up in a low-income home in a small rural community, this wasn't something that we did very often, and so in and of itself, it was an occasion. But what made it unusual was my mother sat down, and we all sat down, and my mother said, "Order anything you want off the menu." And so I remember really distinctly kind of looking at my siblings, and we gave each other that look that children give each other when adults has said something out of character, that kind of, is this lady for real, like question, like look that you often see children give each other. And then I did what kids do when given opportunities. I left at it. So I ordered ribs. And my whole family remembers what they ordered, actually, that meal, because it was a distinct change for my family in terms of our economic well-being. It reduced stress, so there was less family conflict. And it had a generational impact. So it meant that my family was able to pass on that well-being. So although my parents didn't have enough to pay for my university, it meant that they could visit me. So as a rural child going to an urban center, I had a family connection, which in turn increases completion rates, actually. And so there is that generational impact that can be created through a living wage. And I'll be talking a little bit about that. But first, let's talk about the poverty context in BC. So BC is the only province in Canada that doesn't have a poverty reduction plan. I know that across Canada there's some debate about what the impact of those poverty reduction plans are, and they're not all created equally for sure, but we don't have one at all. We're currently going through a consultation process that ends this week that will hopefully feed into the creation of a poverty reduction plan. The majority of poor children in BC live in families with some paid income. And as I said, 1 in 3 live with at least one adult who works a full-time, full-year job. The third stat is one that I feel a little bit embarrassed presenting to families that are struggling with low wage, because it does seem very obvious, but it's one of those obvious things that we've researched and can prove. So of the 27 factors identified as having impact on child development, 80% improve as family income increases. So as families have more income, we know that they do better. Again, it's obvious, but we've researched it. And I think it's really important to talk at both the depth of poverty and the breadth of poverty. So depth of poverty is really important. So when we're talking about how deeply somebody is in poverty, we're often talking in the BC context, talking about people on social assistance or disability, which keeps folks in a very deep poverty. But breadth of poverty is also important. So in BC, we have about 14% of our population on average in poverty, but the total number of people who receive social assistance is around 4%. So the vast majority of people who are in poverty are working. And so keeping an eye on those most impacted, but also keeping an eye on, what is the broad experience of poverty. And in BC, the broad experience of poverty is low-wage poverty. This next slide is a slide that doesn't need a lot of explanation. It's a slide that was created as part of an advocacy listening project that we did with low-wage workers, where low-wage workers developed their own materials to describe their experience of low-wage poverty, but also to advocate for a living wage. And this is the daily schedule of a lot of low-wage workers in BC. It's difficult. And so we see mom waking up at 5 a.m. to prepare food. She's getting the kids up. She's on the bus to childcare. At 7, she's on the bus to work in the suburb. At noon, she ends that first job, and then she's traveling to the next job. She doesn't end work that day until 7 o'clock, picking the kids up from childcare, and at 8 o'clock at night, she's making supper. It's a long day, and often this is every day. So the folks that we work with are often working 2 to 3 jobs, typically no day off. So even on weekends, they're working. And so, when we look at, what are the impacts of poverty, let's think about this day. So let's just keep that in mind, as that is the daily schedule of a lot of folks we work with. And what does this mean in relation to wages? So this is looking at living wage costs between when we started our calculation in 2007 and 2014. And so we've seen that based on our own data, costs in Vancouver have increased by up to 35%, but the overall median income for Vancouver has only increased by 10%. So the 35% is actually the cost of childcare. Rent in that period has gone up by 26%. Food by 20%. And then in BC, we also have an additional cost for basic healthcare provision called a medical services premium. And in that time period, it's gone up by 28%. So we see that wages aren't keeping pace with the cost of goods. And even an inflation rate doesn't necessarily reflect where people are spending their money. So when we look at where folks who are engaged in low-wage work are spending their money, they're spending their money in areas that are increasing at far higher rates than the rate of inflation. So luckily, there has been some policy advocacy in this area so that we can see where policy advocacy can partner with increasing wages to make that experience of low-wage work a little bit better. So this year, the provincial government cut MSP by 50%. And so that's going to have a significant impact for the working poor who are disproportionately targeted by MSP because they don't receive workplace benefits. So who pays for low wages? So low wages are a community problem. So we all pay for low wages in terms of inequality. We pay for low wages in terms of weak local economies. If folks are struggling to make ends meet, they're not taking their kids out for supper. In fact, they're often not even being able to buy groceries. So it's a really limited participation in our local economy. We pay in terms of educational failure. If mom is working from 7 a.m. till 8 at night, she's not able to, do some of this basic homework management that a lot of us take for granted with our kids. Hey, did you hand in that assignment? And we also pay in terms of poor health. The health outcomes of folks experiencing poverty are high. We also know that the mental health outcomes of folks engaged in precarious work, so people who don't know what their schedule will be from one week to the next, are quite high. That level of insecurity has long-term impacts. We also, as a civil society, really suffer. And I think for me, this is one of the things that I think we don't often articulate enough, is we all depend upon a high level of volunteerism in our society. So when mom's working from 7 a.m. to 8 o'clock at night, she's not coaching a soccer team. She's not participating in her faith group. She's not, participating in policy debates on issues that impact her. So we lose out as a society in her voice. We don't hear from her. And I think that's really important. Okay, so what does that mean for employers? So that's all well and good, but what does this mean from an employer perspective? So what we look at is that cycle of high turnover has a cost for business. And that's a cost that employers haven't, in high turnover models, haven't been costing out. And I think it's important that we start to have a conversation about what this model is, what are the costs to the business versus an alternative low turnover, high engagement model. So in BC, the average cost of processing the turnover of a single employee is $22,000. So that's the cost of posting a job, conducting interviews, training and onboarding a new hire, and all the paperwork that comes with it. So, and it's more than just money. So it's also the time. So the time that a manager is spent doing that hiring, that training, they're not doing what the business is designed to do. They're not helping customers. They're not thinking about creative ways to grow their business. They're actually just day to day. So, part of what we're hoping to articulate is, as well as, what are kind of the values impacts of low wage work, there is an actual financial cost to businesses around a high turnover, low wage model. Okay, so what is the difference then between minimum wage and living wage? So in our view, minimum wage is the responsibility of the provincial government to address working poverty. That governments have a role to play in addressing poverty, and a healthy, robust minimum wage is precisely the role of government. But we don't think our responsibility ends there. That businesses and employers also have a role to play on working poverty, and we think that a living wage, which sets a higher bar, provides an opportunities for employers to walk the talk on their values and to reduce working poverty through increasing wages and providing health benefits. So we think that there is an opportunity for both to step in, and they're complementary. So what is a living wage? A living wage is a bare bones calculation that includes items such as rent, groceries, extended health care. Importantly, we also include 2 weeks savings for each adult. Often workers don't have paid sick leave, so that 2 week savings fills in for those times when your child has a cold. You can't take them to childcare because childcare won't accept children who are sick, so you have to take a day off unpaid. And so having those savings is a really important buffer. What doesn't it include? It does not include debt repayment. It doesn't include savings for future plans. It doesn't include additional costs of caring for a sick or ill family member. From an employer's perspective, paying a living wage is a combination of salary and non-mandatory benefits equal to the living wage. So we do have a calculator on our website for communities across BC for employers to calculate the value of their benefits plans. But this can include things like extended health, vacation above the mandatory minimum required by employment standards. It can also include paid sick leave or professional development training. So what are opportunities that employers have to provide to their staff that can help them continue to support their families, and move themselves forward. Okay, so as a campaign, it's important to say we're winning. This is a really great conversation. Lots of folks are wanting to talk about the living wage. It's a really exciting moment. As somebody who's been working on economic justice for a while, I think this is a really exciting moment to talk about these issues, that there is a broader dialogue that's taking place. And a lot of people are seeing that they have a role to play in that dialogue. So at this point in BC, we have 9 local governments with living wage policies, including the City of Vancouver, which is the largest employer in Canada, who pays a living wage to all their direct staff. And more significantly, when the City of Vancouver signed on to pay a living wage, they signed on to pay a living wage for all their direct and contract staff. So we see over 5 million of their service contracts were directly impacted by the living wage. In terms of those contracts, every worker was below the living wage. So there's a broader understanding of some of these impacts that includes cleaning, security, and graffiti removal. Other contracts that the City of Vancouver had that were impacted by the living wage are kind of individual folks within those contracts who may not have been earning a living wage, like flagging staff on construction sites. And it's also about identifying where vulnerable work is located. In our view, vulnerable work is often located in the supply chain, and so how can we get at supply chains through our advocacy? That this is an area of work where we see people engage in persistent low-wage work. It's not just 1 year. We're talking entire careers, working lives in low-wage work. This is the living wage is a regional calculation. So here's a map of some of the living wages across BC. They range from $20.62 an hour in Vancouver to $16.39 in North Central region. In some of the higher tourist areas, we see a higher living wage. So Clayoquot Sound, which some of you may know as Tofino or Long Beach, has a living wage of $20.11. Revelstoke, $18.77. These are primarily tourist-driven economies, and so they have high housing rates as a result. Again, Northeast region, we have an extractive economy, and so again, high housing costs drive that. So the living wage is also a way to articulate the impacts of the economy on folks' experiences. How do you become a living wage employer? So this first step to become a living wage employer, and I'm going to whip through this because Catherine does a far better job of articulating some of these issues. So the first step is to identify the living wage and the value of your benefits, so using our calculator online. The second step is reviewing your service contracts. So what are the contracts that you have? We're specifically looking at labor service contracts. This is often the heavy lifting of the living wage, and Catherine will talk very articulately about the work that Vancity did in identifying their service contracts and bringing them up to the living wage. And then the final step is apply. Certify as a living wage employer. Certification is really important in terms of giving us the numbers that we need in order to do the advocacy that we do. So even if you think, well, we're already a living wage employer, what is the impact of us certifying? It lets me say, when I stand in front of government, we have over 100 employers who have 18,000 staff. We do represent a large number of employers. So when I do advocacy with government around some of the issues that increase the living wage or have an impact on working families, it gives me that added voice. So definitely add your voice to the campaign. And thank you. And I'll let Catherine step in and talk about some of the work that she did. I would encourage you to follow us on all the social media. If you have any specific questions, our email address is there. But I'm going to let Catherine talk about the Vancity experience.
Thanks, Deanna. And just as a bridge from where Deanna closed off there to talking about certifying as employers, you know, Deanna and I are both here in Vancouver and very familiar with the Living Wage for Families campaign here, which is where Deanna works. But there's the Ontario Living Wage Network. Larry, you're familiar with the work that the CCPA Nova Scotia office is doing to build a network there and to certify employers. There's an Alberta Living Wage Network, a startup organization in Saskatchewan. So there are living wage activists and advocates across the country that are developing certification programs. So I work inside Vancity Credit Union in the community investment team, and I've got dual responsibility, one for ensuring that the credit union itself became and remains a living wage employer, and corollary to that, to talking to other employers to encourage them to join the living wage campaign. So I'm happy to tell you a little bit about our experience. But the next slide here shows where we are across the country as of, this was the 1st of January of this year. So you can see the living wage in Metro Vancouver, as Deanna has said, is $20.62 The minimum wage in BC is now $11.35. It's only very recently gone there. We had one of the lowest living wage rates, but you can see across the country the low minimum wages relative to what we might understand are the costs of living. And while people might have some sense of the cost of living here in Metro Vancouver, equally housing costs and childcare costs across the country are outstripping the ability of low-wage workers to meet those wages. So employers sometimes say to me, well, why should we as employers voluntarily pay the living wage, and shouldn't we really be focusing our efforts on governments to increase the minimum wage, if employers even say that? And my answer is this: it's paying the living wage voluntarily by an employer is something we can do to make up for public policy failures. Across the country, the lack of a universal, accessible, quality childcare plan or program means the costs of childcare are enormous for families, for families with children. In BC, we calculate that the living wage at $20.62, fully $4 of that wage is eaten up by the cost of childcare. Also, and we're in a changing time in this province with the new government. Deanna talked a bit about the MSP and the recent cut to it. We have been the only province in the country, we believe, where citizens have had to pay their own tax or premium on their medical care. And to date, that has also cost the equivalent of $1 of the living wage. So those failures for childcare and for an elimination of the individual premium on medical services, that $5 is fully $5 of what the living wage rate is. So you can see what would happen if we had better public policy. The living wage would drop actually to something coming close to $15 an hour, which is where a number of jurisdictions are now going. So what as employers do you need to do? You, as Deanna said, you commit to paying a living wage rate, but it's important to pay not only your employees, but also to commit to ensuring your key suppliers pay their employees a living wage rate. So the Living Wage Campaign premises that we want all the workers that are providing labor services, whether we employ them directly or we contract them through procurement processes, to be paid a living wage, because they're all contributing to our business outputs. So we want not only our employees, but also our contracted workers. And frankly, for any employer, it's much easier to get started with your own employees. When we embarked on this journey in 2011, we found that 98% of our own staff were already being paid a living wage rate. We were mortified, of course, that 2% were not. But that was relatively easy to rectify. And in a unionized environment, we weren't at a moment to go back into bargaining with the union. Our union was very happy that we put a side agreement onto the collective agreement saying what our new floor for wages would be, and we topped up salary for 2 years in the form of a premium until we went back into bargaining with the absolute agreement of the union. And I should also say, Deanna showed you the graphs of what makes up the living wage. It's important to remember when you're thinking about your workforce, your people, that of the living wage, if you're a good employer and offer extended medical or extended holidays, perhaps $3 or $4 of the living wage will be reflected in those additional benefits. So the base wage would come down. But really the details, the tricky part is for sure direct services. Where do you contract for labor, and where do you understand you're buying goods, and where are you buying labor services? And that is, as Deanna said, the heavy lifting and the piece that can be a little bit daunting, but it's absolutely doable for any employer. At our credit union, when we assessed all of the pieces where we had contracted labor, we found that we had 1,200 contracts across 45 different industry sectors. And that gave us pause. And then we worked with the campaign to come up with a practical way to manage through that. So we have dealt with 90% of our spend for labor services. We are never going to get to 100% of our spend on labor services, because when we analyzed how many of those 1,200 contracts we could deal with. It turned out that 90% of our discretionary spend for labor services was in about around 50 contracts. So it's up to employers to deal with their local living wage campaigns to propose a path through to how you're going to deal with labor services. But as Deanna said, and we know, this is where the low wage work lies. And so it's critically important that any employer embrace not just paying your own employees the living wage rate, but you actually address those contracted workers. And that's when we start to see a real change in the face of poverty in our communities. So this photo, this is an old photo now, it's from 2013 at our certification when we became a living wage employer. And that woman at the microphone is Barbara Kaminsky, who was then the head of the BC Cancer Society. And they had recently become a living wage employer. And they'd had some struggles at the board table around this because they wondered whether their donors would support a not-for-profit paying its own staff a living wage. And, Barbara said to them, all the social determinants of health tell us that people living in poverty have poorer health outcomes. We believe poverty is a carcinogen, and so it only makes sense, it's only right that the Canadian Cancer Society would pay its staff a living wage. And those fellows in the back were also part of the campaign at the time. The guy in the pink shirt smiling was a very small manufacturer. He made trophies, and I think he had a workforce of 10 or 12 folks. And he was an early adopter of the living wage because he said, happy people do awesome work. And for him, paying the living wage completely reduced churn at his manufacturing facility and reduced errors and improved productivity. I know for our credit union, for Vancity, we get to be proud of lots of things we do, as any good employer does, and get awards and whatever. But paying the living wage actually became the most important, the thing that all employees were most proud of in recent memory. Remember, only 2% of our employees actually got a wage increase as a result of joining the living wage campaign. But all employees look at this as a very proud moment and tell their friends and families, and so they've become ambassadors for the credit union with their pride about us being a living wage employer. And there are real, as Deanna said, there are real concrete benefits to employers. That happy workers do awesome work, but it does lead, and has been shown to be a halving of the employee turnover rates because your employees are not looking for another job while they're at work, they're working. It's shown improved performance and service delivery. 3/4 of employers say paying a living wage has brought increased consumer confidence, so has improved their brand and the stickiness of their clients or customers. And work quality goes up and productivity goes up. So there's absolutely quantifiable benefits to paying a living wage. I'm going to go quickly through this slide. This was a surprise to us because it was not why we joined the living wage campaign, but because we changed the relationship with our suppliers. We were no longer in an adversarial across the table negotiating for whatever we were buying, from elevator repair people to people on site moving furniture and accounting and legal and janitorial. We now invite all our contractors in at the beginning of a contracting cycle and say, here's the living wage journey we're on. We will privilege those contracts that pay a living wage. We don't expect you to find it in your margins. We will pay more. And that has fundamentally changed our relationship with those suppliers. So we had set aside $1 million in year one to come compliant with the living wage. It only cost us $700,000 at our size. That was considered a rounding error. But the second year, we saved $2 million, not on labor costs, but on tidying up of other contracts, and suppliers were no longer selling us 1,000 somethings, they were selling us 387. And so they started to unpack contracts and take off everything that had been packed over time because we were not in a positive shoulder-to-shoulder relationship. That's not why we went into it, so it was a surprise, a happy surprise, but there it is. And this fellow, he's a gazillionaire from Seattle. He has been saying, he wrote a very interesting, provocative article for Forbes a couple of years called "The Pitchforks Are Coming," and he thinks of himself as an enlightened an enlightened one percenter, and he knows the value of paying people enough. Some might argue it's pacifying people, but paying people enough that they can afford to live and participate in their communities. And others might know that Henry Ford also knew that it was important to pay enough to keep workers productively engaged in your own workforce. And we know that paying a living wage helps us build a strong local economy and reinvest in a strong local economy. Local businesses reinvest 2 to 4 times as much in the local economy as big box and create 3 times as many jobs. When you're paying a living wage in your business, no matter what size, to your employees, they have money in their pockets. They reinvest in the local economy. They get a haircut. They take their kids out for pizza. They buy a new pair of shoes. The money doesn't leave town, doesn't go into recreational properties or vacations. It goes right back into the local economy and builds local jobs. So a living wage is actually a great economic development strategy. And Michael Schumann, who's an American economist and activist, wrote Small Mart Revolution and Loconomics, said paying the living wage is to Walmart what kryptonite was to Superman. That it, in fact, is the antidote. When you pay a living wage and you support small businesses in the local economy, that is one way to counter globalization and the effects that big box have on our communities. So as a co-op, we think that's really important. So I'd encourage any employer to consider joining the living wage campaign. This is a roadmap for large employers to deal with the complexity of contractors. It's available on our website, and I can send anyone that wishes a link to it. But we really are committed to this campaign and to sharing our knowledge with other employers. And frankly, because the more employers that come in, the more we're doing what we set out to do, which is tackle low-wage poverty in our communities. And we're happy to help get started. That's my email on the top line, livingwage@vancity.com. I'm happy to answer questions offline with any employer. And then the URL at the bottom is Living Wage Canada, which is a collection where you can see all the employers, or all the campaigns that exist across the country. So Larry, we'll wrap there and go to the question period, I think.
That's great. That's great. Thank you very much, but we'll give you more thanks at the end. Now, I just want to remind the audience that if you go to your dialog box on the right-hand side that says go to webinar, you can actually click to raise your hand, and when you do, I will unmute you and allow you to ask a question. The other thing you can do is go to the part that says questions. We've gotten a couple of comments in the questions part, but if you don't want to speak, if you can't speak, if you have to go, or if the audio doesn't work, send us a question. And we already have one question, which is, what is the link to the PDF, please?
Oh, sorry, if you go to vancity.com and then Google living wage in our search box, that will take you to a living wage page. And about halfway down the page, there is the link for the PDF. Marketing helped me with it, so it's full of graphics, so it's too big to email. So you can pick it up yourself, vancity.com, and then Google living wage, and you'll find the PDF halfway down the page. And it talks about building a leadership campaign internally, the importance of bringing on finance, procurement, as well as HR folks, and then building a group to assess the distance you have to travel to become a living wage employer.
Okay, now we have a question from Andrew Stevens. So I'm just going to unmute you now, Andrew, and go ahead.
Terrific. Thank you both very much. I think we've had the privilege of speaking in the past over the phone. I'm here based in Regina. I have a question actually in my capacity as a city councillor. There was a motion approved several years ago to have the city of Regina actually examine a living wage policy, and it's been kind of slow to get off the ground. But my question is, I understand the value of Vancity's commitment to being a better employer. I'm really curious about how these discussions went with the city of Vancouver. So what's your advice on actually getting the ball rolling in a city about what's the scope of the issue, how much work is involved with actually mapping out procurement practices and taking responsibility over supply chains? So really, when you're confronting a civic government, what's some of the advice of how you make it a living wage employer and the role that Living Wage Canada might play in brokering that agreement?
Yeah, Andrew, I think that there's a couple things that we do when we speak to municipalities around how to sign on to be a living wage employer. And I think for us, it's kind of seeing it as two ways. And so Catherine and I often partner on this. We're like this kind of super tag team effort where I'm the campaigner, so I'm the kind of scary activist. And then Catherine is the responsible business person. And so often my role is presenting to council. Yeah. So talking to council, talking to community around what is the role of leadership on the as a municipality. And so the way we around the living wage, and so the way we frame it in that context is that, what people want from their local governments is that their local government support and invest in local economies. And a way to do that, so there's a lot of ways that local governments do that, and one way to do that is to ensure that they're doing that through both paying staff enough that they're supporting the local economy, but also through smart procurement. So both investing in purchasing strategies that benefit the local economy through ensuring that so Cornell, I think, would be a good match for Regina in terms of some of the debates that are happening, because they really match their procurement strategy, their living wage strategy with a local purchasing strategy, so that they were doing purchasing a bit more locally. And then those folks who were doing that work, so cleaning, security, were also earning enough to invest in the local economies. And then but then we can't leave staff out of the equation, because staff in municipalities play a very important, vital role. And so often we're also presenting to staff on what is the value of the living wage. How do you find an accessible, appropriate path forward that takes into account often the limited staff capacity that folks in municipalities actually face?
Yeah, thanks. And I would say Deanna's absolutely right. It's kind of we've worked in kind of a tag team format here, and while Deanna has been talking to City Council, and I would say a great place to start is for Council to vote a motion to have staff prepare a report about where a municipality currently is with wages, and to look at its contracts for labor. At the same time, it's important for someone to be meeting with those staff and encouraging them, because the staff will, in many municipalities, are working, as they often are in private businesses, to save money. And they need to be encouraged to relax a little bit and to open-heartedly and open-mindedly go into an examination process to look at how far municipal government is away from paying a living wage. And many will be absolutely happily surprised to find the gap is not that big. But it's important that those two move along at the same time. As the political body moves along, staff are brought along as well. Because we've seen, Deanna and I have seen, where staff are left behind and the political body moves forward and staff haven't been brought along. A balking staff will not happily implement a living wage policy and will not happily enter into negotiations with suppliers. So you really need to do those two things together. I should also say it's a long process, so it takes patience. It can take, I think, City of Vancouver, we worked on that for 3 years, inside and outside.
Actively, once they passed a motion. Yeah. So it took us, I think, 7 years to get a motion. And then to actually move from a motion to implementation. Yeah. So to be clear that like any policy, it moves at the pace of municipal government. So, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Okay. So my grandkids might actually be able to witness this policy. Yeah, great. All right.
Not to, kill the dream, Andrew, but I think that, I think that there's really interesting work that you can do in Regina, and contact me at info@livingwageforfamilies.ca, and maybe I can link some of the staff with staff in municipalities in BC, and that can be really helpful in terms of pushing the conversation forward.
It speeds it up too. The more municipal governments are in, like we've seen the campaign speed up at other municipal governments, because now they've got peers to ask about the journey.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Great. And our next questioner is Gary Burkhart, although he lowered his hand, but I'll unmute Gary and see if he's there. Gary, are you there? Gary? Well, I'll see. He might come back. While we're waiting for some other questions, I have some. Speaking of somebody in Halifax, where we've had less than blazing success in convincing employers to go along with the living wage, what is it about BC that makes you so successful? What do you think?
Larry, we've been at this for a long time. The campaign in BC came out of a SHIRK project that the BC office of CCPA was leading, and when that project wound up in 2008, the folks around the table that have been contributing to that project, that academic research project, said, what next? And that's when the living wage campaign was adopted as the next set of action. So that's 10 years that we've been at it. We're the longest standing campaign in the country. And because it came out of that collective decision at the beginning, there were folks around the table, including a number of labor unions, the credit unions, and some employers, and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and First Call, that have been working together. So, yes, I think that collective ownership of the campaign from the beginning was very helpful.
Mm-hmm. I think the collective ownership has been really helpful. I think the other piece has been building campaign capacity. So, having staff with dedicated time to develop materials to support the campaign has actually been very important. And to be clear, my funding comes from Vancity, so thank you, Vancity, and thank you all Vancity members out there who are listening, or credit union members, right? There's that community investment piece that a lot of credit unions are committed to, and my work is part of that. And then also labor has been a huge supporter. And so that has built capacity for me to create the materials that have built, and my predecessor, Michael, who was in one of the photos, that built a path forward for employers. So we worked really hard to kind of create a framework that balanced the aspirational poverty reduction goals of the campaign with the practical realities of implementing it. And so, we continue to work to strive that balance. So there is an open dialogue with our employers around, what are our learnings and our successes. And I think having employers be part of our journey with us has been really important, that we've learned a lot. So, I think creating that, that big tent, is really hard, but I think has been really important to our success.
Okay. I'm waiting to see anybody else want to put their hand up before I have to come up with another question. Actually, I don't want to single you out, but it's too complicated for me to send an email. But among our audience is Christine Saulnier, who's the director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Nova Scotia. And without embarrassing you or anything, can you, you've had a lot of success here in terms of raising awareness of all of the issues surrounding living wage and minimum wage. Do you care to say anything, Christine?
Hi, Larry. Thanks so much, Deanna and Catherine. I don't know if anybody is on the webinar that's with the Halifax Regional Municipality or that government, but I was sitting here wishing that we had alerted them so that they could have listened to a fantastic presentation by you. I know that they've been in touch with you, and that gives me a little bit of hope that at least there's some consideration via staff. And so I take your points there, Catherine and Deanna, about, you know, strategy on the ground of kind of supporting the staff to figure out what this might look like for Halifax. I mean, for us in Nova Scotia, and I'm now supporting St. John, New Brunswick to calculate, and we've supported a couple of communities here. But here in particular in Halifax, because, you know, I'm here physically and I go to meetings, I'm really struck about how important the benchmark has been to have that out there in the community for people to talk about all of the issues that you have raised. It gives people a concrete way to enter the conversation, both about the benchmark itself, so the actual hourly wage and the cost factor in our community, so it's real. And then it opens up questions about how do we set the minimum wage and what goes into that, and how do they compare, given that Halifax's wage living was quite high, right? So I guess, but we have not ever launched a campaign because we just don't have the capacity to do that as of yet. And so it's been important, but the potential for it here has stalled in that sense about the kind of campaign strategy side. So if there's anything else that you can add around, and I know you just answered that part to Larry, but around the engagement of employers or around the other kinds of ways that we can continue, I think, to push forward the dialogue. And as you talked about, Catherine, the public policy side is also a critical piece. And that, I think, is the power of the living wage, is that you also bring into the conversation where's the balance, what role do private employers play, what role does our government play also as an employer, but also as the provider of of services. And the other thing that I think the living wage spotlights is kind of across the country, right? We can do some comparisons when we use the same methodology around costs. And I think people have been surprised to see how high some costs are in Halifax, and that we take into account taxation and transfer. So I don't know, that's kind of, yeah.
Yeah. You know, I think it highlights the opportunities for regional policy advocacy. And I think, you know, at least in British Columbia, I think across communities, and I know, Christine, you do fabulous and amazing policy advocacy, but what we find in communities is that our muscles are a bit weak, that we haven't been doing really strong policy advocacy in our communities in BC for a while, mainly because we've had a provincial government that wasn't interested in bold policy around poverty reduction. So we, for years, were doing incremental policy advocacy. So if you can change this just little tiny regulation, maybe we can see a benefit, and then trying to widen those gaps. And then, you know, federally, we've also had that similar approach, that we had governments withdrawing from areas. And so I think the living wage can start to build that conversation. I think the question that comes back to us as folks interested in this issue is, how do we organize ourselves to build our capacity for change? And that's a really big question. And I think that becomes, you know, seeing where are the opportunities and where is the energy, and that's challenging in the context of low wage work, because again, moving back to the schedule, we're dealing with folks who are really busy, who are overcommitted, who don't have the time to participate in advocacy in the same way. So when we're centering low wage workers in that advocacy, it's very challenging work. But ultimately, I think the reward is worth it, that there's incredible opportunities for change. I was working with a group of low-wage workers Monday evening, and and their vision for change is really broad. That coming out of a conversation, the three things that they wanted to work on was increasing wages, decreasing the cost of childcare, and importantly, changing our tax system so that folks who had resources were paying more and folks who were struggling had more benefit.
Okay, I'm going to intervene here and try and shoehorn in one more question. Gary Burkhart actually sent this in on the questions. Are you butting heads with the trade unions on this issue? I.e., if the employers can find money for contractors to pay a living wage, then they should be able to find money for general wage increases under a collective bargaining relationship. What do you think of that?
So, it's interesting. I would say that, no, we're not butting heads with trade unions on this. And this is not a bargaining strategy. This is a poverty reduction strategy. So working with some municipal governments, there has been an initial challenge with the union where there are some low-wage workers in the bottom of the union scale, and the union has perhaps rightfully been worried about wage compression in the salary bands. But, I feel entirely confident saying this is not a bargaining strategy. This is a poverty reduction strategy, and no more would union brothers and sisters say we shouldn't have an 8-hour workday, nor should we not have minimum wages, that it's fundamentally right to look beside us and lift up our brothers and sisters to a living wage, that the living wage should be the new minimum wage, should be a living wage. And so this is not a bargaining strategy. And when we approach it like that, the union leadership nods their heads and says, we agree.
And so do the workers. So, part of this has always been, we've partnered quite strongly with trade unions. So, some of our strongest supporters are a lot of the trade, I think there's a myth that all workers and trade unions are earning a living wage, because that's absolutely not true. Yeah. So we work with quite a few trade unions where the vast majority of their members are under the living wage. And I think that partnering those, sorry, I'm getting the time, so I'm going to try and wrap up my thought. But partnering, it's making sure that the trade unions who aren't earning a living wage are communicating the challenges of their members to other unions, so that they're hearing those stories from their brothers and sisters and from their union members, so that they're partnering and working together as well. There's opportunities for solidarity.
Okay. Thank you very much. Nice. Sorry, I had to rush you there, but we're almost at the end of our hour. I just want to remind everybody, because it came, Christine raised it, there are people who should be watching this, who may not have been able or didn't know about it or whatever. It is being recorded, and the Canadian Industrial Relations Association will be putting it on its website. Just remind you that they'll also be putting the first webinar that we had this season on the political economy of the pensions crisis with Hugh McKenzie. So I'm going to wrap up here, thanking our special guests, Catherine and Deanna, for a very interesting topic, and for everybody who either spoke or sent in questions. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.